So first, I'm going to be talking about the status of children and how that relates to our work in co-counseling, our work on our own emotional healing. And some of the ideas may be quite new to you that I'm going to talk about here. You might even not entirely agree at first. I find that once people get a chance to digest this information, they actually rarely disagree, even if it's a little bit of a shock at first, a little bit of a collision at first with things you've believed before. So my essential beginning point is that children are an oppressed group and face as severe and classic a form of oppression as any of the groups that we talk about as oppressed group. When you're talking about the oppression of the working class, of people who work for a living, when you're talking about oppression by race, when you're talking about oppression by sex, when we're talking about oppression by different sexual orientation, all the different kind of classic things that we talk about and struggle with day to day as we work for a just world, there tends to be a missing huge piece there, which is what we've come to call adultism, which is the oppression of children as a group by the adult world. And this is an oppression that nobody escapes. I mean, everybody is either a child or a former child. So this makes it particularly striking that this is generally absent from the discussion. And I think what it largely speaks to is how much, as a society, we're completely still bought in to a very, very negative view of children and teenagers, children and adolescents. And I'm often going to be collapsing children and adolescents into one term when I'm talking about children or young people. The prejudice against them and the sense of the right to mistreat them in certain ways is so rampant through the society that people can't even see that there's a problem there. When you try to talk about children as a oppressed group, people say, but wait a minute, they're kids, which would be like 200 years ago in many societies trying to talk to men about the oppression of women. Their response would have been like, but wait a minute, they're women. And so it's a very similar kind of mindset. So to explain some basics about how I think about oppression and why the oppression of children is inescapable and central to my thinking about how society works. So what's oppression about? Oppression is about a group that is systematically targeted by a more powerful group, by a dominant group in society, to keep it down and to take that group's rights away, to exploit that group's labor. That's not always true in oppression, but it almost always involves some element of exploiting that group's labor and of making that group accept a status of being fundamentally less, of being essentially inferior in their humanity. And how is this not true of children in the modern world? And children aren't just seen as somehow less knowledgeable or less experienced, which they are. They're seen as fundamentally less human. And I'll give some examples soon about just all kinds of ways that people talk about children that are just considered acceptable ways to talk about them and make assumptions about them that are acceptable assumptions societally to make about them. And children are targets of incredible amount of violence and sexual violation, completely silenced, given no say in society. How is this any different from any other form of oppression? So I believe that one of the single most devastating aspects of any experience of oppression is being treated as if you were fundamentally inferior. You are fundamentally less human. You're just less. It's devastating to realize that that's how you're viewed, to realize that that's how you're being treated, and that when you protest that treatment, that's just seen as further evidence of how inferior you are. So that's a key element of oppression that we're badly wounded by, all of us, as I say, because we're all children or former children. Anybody who's living in a modernized society, which is almost everybody in the globe today, has experienced this. There, in many tribes, perhaps in most tribes, in tribal times, children didn't have that second-class status. They weren't seen as somehow less human. But in the modernized world, this is really this is an essential way that a modern hierarchical society is structured and how the culture of a modernized society works. So we're all carrying really profound wounds from the experience of being treated as if we were less. And I want to say, based on that, a bunch of things that people say about children just as if they're facts. They'll say, oh, well, children just think the whole world revolves around them. And all they think about is their own needs. It just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit what happens if you're actually carefully observing children, is you see how many generous impulses they naturally have. You see how those really have to be kind of knocked out of them, how many ways their wounds gradually push them towards selfishness, but that's not where they begin. And I think of this experience I had when I was fairly young, a young adult, helping just with volunteer childcare at an event and looking after a little girl who was maybe just barely a year old. She wasn't talking a whole lot. And in fact, she was really only saying a few words, as I recall. But she was eating a banana that her parents had left her with when they dropped her to childcare. And she would take a bite of the banana and then reach it out to me for a bite. And I would take a bite and she would reach it to me, to herself, and take a bite. And then she would reach it out to me again, and maybe I would say no thank you or whatever. But after every bite that she took, she would offer it to me. That was just her thought of, like, that's how you eat a banana. And one thing that I remember hearing a lot in the social work and therapy world is, oh, well, the reason children are just feel so guilty about things that happen to them, like in their families, for example, is that children just think the whole world revolves around them, so they think anything that happened they must have caused. Children don't believe the whole world revolves around them. The reason they feel so guilty about things that happen around them is because they've been repeatedly blamed throughout so much of their childhood for things that were in no way their fault. That's why they started to develop the sense anything bad around me is my fault, is because of how many times they've been told that. Not because somehow that's like some inherent nature of children. Children, by and large, aren't nearly as self-centered as the very self-centered adults that we so often have to deal with. But we're just told this as fact. Now, of course, children can't have equal say about decisions in a family, in a community, in the world that adults need to have. They don't have the same experience. They don't have the same level of knowledge. They don't have the same ability to do certain kinds of complex reasoning, though generally much more so than they're given credit for. But the reality that they can't be given an equal voice is used as an excuse to give them no voice at all, and to ridicule them, to punish them, to retaliate against them for their efforts to have a voice. And children have a right to be heard. They have a right to protest decisions that they think are unjust and be listened to carefully about that and taken seriously. We're not necessarily going to agree or give in, but they have a right to be heard about their objections. And they have a right to have their opinions and preferences carry significant weight. It doesn't have to be equal weight to an adult. It shouldn't be, but significant weight. Like, wow, we really have to think, well, how are we going to let our decisions be influenced by what children are telling us? And I think one of the great mistakes that adults in general make is that their interactions with children are generally focused on, what do these children need to be learning from me? What do I need to be teaching them? And that's a mistake. That should at most be half of our orientation, and the other half of our orientation should be, what do I need to learn from these children about how to live, about consciousness, about enthusiasm, about delight in the world, about imagination? My children had every bit as much to teach me as I had to teach them. Of course, there's a whole other subject here, which is that I wish adult interactions with children would in general be much less about anybody teaching anyone anything and much more about just enjoying being together. Okay, so that connects then to another point that I want to make, which is that part of the destructive outlook on children in childhood is the view that childhood is a stage of preparing to be an adult. That's a bad way, in my opinion, to look at childhood. Childhood is a stage of being a child. One of the things you have to do during childhood is to prepare to be an adult. But that doesn't mean that that's what childhood is. That means that that's one aspect of what childhood is. But mostly childhood is about living. It's about living as a child, being a child. Notice that we don't do this with regard to other stages in life. We don't think of, well, the point of young adulthood is to be prepared to be middle age, or what middle age is about preparing to be an older person, or being an old person is about preparing to be dead, to preparing to die. Those are all things we have to do at each of those stages in life in order to have the next stage go well. But that doesn't mean that that's what defines that stage, that that's what that stage is. And yet with childhood, that's how we define what it is. You're working on becoming an adult. So we need to be much more valuing of childhood as a way of looking at the world, as a way of experiencing life that's just as valid as the adult way of experiencing life. That's a wonderful way to look at the world. And in our healing work, in our co-counseling work, that means that we want to be reconnecting with what was great about being a child when we were children, what was great about other children, what was great about our worldview, what was clear and smart about our thinking, what were things that we were actually seeing much more clearly than the adults were, because we've all had various aspects of as children when we were the ones that actually were seeing things the way they really were the ones facing things honestly, or we were the ones perceiving injustice. I'm not just talking about injustice towards children. Often as children, we were perceiving other kinds of injustice in the world that the adults were failing to see, mistreatment of animals or adult mistreatment of one another. And there are all kinds of things that children are the ones that they're seeing well. So we want to go back to that kind of experience with pride. And that's an important part of how we process certain experiences from childhood. Which leads me to the concept of internalized oppression, which I want to say a little bit about, and some of you may have heard me already talk about this in other contexts. But internalized oppression is the process through which, when you're a target of oppression, you come to view yourself in a similar way to how the oppressing group, the dominant group, is viewing you. And you come to see your own people, the other people in your group, in similar ways to how the dominant group, how the oppressors view you. This is one of the ways that the wounds play out. One of the patterns, one of the results of the wounds we suffer from oppression is that the oppression gets internalized. So some of the ways we see this in children is that children, for example, start to work very hard to be adults, to look like adults, to talk like adults, to be bigger, to be older, because that's what's going to make me less part of that inferior group. So children become extraordinarily preoccupied with when their next birthday is and when they're going to be a year older and when they're going to be bigger. And that's internalized oppression. Being excited about your birthday is an internalized oppression, but that obsession with, when am I going to be a year older is about how children are being that's a product of how children are being mistreated. And the adult world in so many ways sends the message to children that being small is bad. And we'd say to kids all the time, oh, how big you are, how big you've gotten, or, oh, you're behaving in such a big way today. What a big girl you're being. What a big boy you're being. Oh, you accomplished such and such. Oh, you got yourself dressed. What a big girl. Or, oh, you used the potty. What a big boy. What's the message there? The message is bigger is better than smaller. Oh, you're being so grown up. That means being a grown up is better than being a kid. Those are messages that are directly teaching the inferiority of children, and they're teaching that older children are at least better than younger children. And so that's what younger children strive for, is to be older children because they're still an oppressed group, but at least you're in a better position than the younger children, which again happens in all kinds of other forms of oppression, where these workers at least feel better than these other workers, where the lighter-skinned people of color at least feel better than the darker-skinned people of color. Right? This is what an oppressive system creates. It's not the fault of the oppressed group. This is the shape that our wounds take, and our battle for some respect and some privileges from the dominant group takes. This is how these things are naturally going to play out. So then children start to also look down upon other children. They start to see other children as immature and often will start to distance themselves, try to show that they're not like the other kids. The same way as internalized depression will play out in other groups where people try to say, oh, well, I'm not like the other women, or I'm not, I'm different from the other gay people, or whatever it may be, to try to somehow ease the impact of the oppression by saying, oh no, I'm not like those people. A friend of mine just told me quite a moving story about a very tight friendship he had when he was a kid with somebody his own age, that just their friendship just played out mostly in this fantasy world. They would just tell each other stories and in just this like wonderful invented world. And then one year, one of the boys' older brother discovered these letters that were going back and forth between the two boys. Their families had moved apart, and just started scolding his younger brother. You're being such a baby. You can't be, these are just such immature things you're talking about. And unfortunately, the younger brother just was shamed by this. In other words, the older brother was successful in getting the younger brother to be very shamed of his own childness. And so then he wrote to my friend, oh, we can't do those childish, those baby games anymore. We got to start talking about grown-up stuff like sports. And their friendship was torpedoed by internalized oppression. They couldn't play these wonderful fantasy games that were so precious to my friend when he was a kid, because of the way his friend had just been essentially indoctrinated by his older brother into the internalization of oppression. So when we are trying to work on healing from the impact that adultism had on our own lives, from all the ways that we were wounded as children for the fact that we were children, all the ways that we were squelched and held down by the adult world, those sessions are going to tend to go better when we work on them from a position of as much pride as we can muster, to think about what we loved about children, to think about what we loved about other kids, to take a kind of defiant stance. Yes, I'm a child, sort of re-entering, right, the child world, remembering myself as a 6-year-old, remembering myself as a 10-year-old, remembering myself as a 14-year-old, and work in that session from a sense of like, I knew what I was talking about. I knew what I was seeing. I should have been listened to. I was a great kid. Kids are great people. That's going to make it easier for us to get to the emotions, and it's going to make it easier for us to get to those emotions in a way where they can actually move through us. As I say this, I'm reminded of something I forgot to say earlier, which is that in our times, it seems like it's even more legitimate to talk extremely negatively about adolescents, about teenagers, than it is to talk badly about younger children. And people who would never talk in a bigoted way about any other group will unhesitatingly just trash adolescents. Teenagers are this, teenagers are that, teenagers. No effort to look at the oppression that teenagers face, no effort to look at the conditions they're having to live in, no effort to look at how terrible the schooling systems are, et cetera, just on and on. No effort to actually get to know teenagers and realize what amazing and creative and loving people they are when they're given a chance and have a mission in life and are being well respected themselves and so forth. It's oppressive to have people be able to just talk about have it be legit to just talk about a whole group like there's some kind of piece of junk. Okay, so just a couple of other things that I will say. I believe that our experiences of childhood oppression also help prepare us to participate in oppression as adults, both in the oppressor role and in the oppressed role. And so I believe it's a very important preparation ground to set us up to then also be the victims or the perpetrators of sexism and racism and classism and so forth. And then another dynamic that I want to draw people's attention to is that most adults can't remember what it was like to be a child. By the time we're into adulthood, we've just forgotten And that's part of why we can then turn around and treat other children in similar ways. The way we were treated is we don't remember anymore what that felt like. And we don't remember anymore the injustice of it. We've lost the children's side of the experience. And I think that primarily occurs for two reasons. One is because of the trauma of being subjected to adultism, and we know that trauma can lead to a lot of memory loss. But I think the other reason it happens is that we escape adultism, we gradually become adults, and we escape it very gradually, right? A 10-year-old in some ways is going to have a few more rights and maybe a little more freedom from some of the worst aspects of adultism than a 4-year-old will. And maybe a 15-year-old, things will get a little better, or at least they know they can, look down on the younger children, as I was explaining earlier. So it's like we're getting out of it little by little by little. It's not like it stays just as bad to a certain line and then it's gone, because we wouldn't forget it, I don't think, if it would stay just as bad to like a certain date or a certain age, and then overnight we were out of it. But I think when we escape something very, very gradually, it makes it really difficult to remember what it was like. So for adults now who want to be good allies to children in their liberation, part of what we need to do is go back and remember what it was like. Well, that's essential to our own healing also. We want to work on pride, taking pride in who we were as children. This is related to what I was talking about earlier, to work on things from that perspective, and to work on things from an outlook of militance. I would say almost of being militant, of thinking about what would you have been if you were like the childhood version of like a Black Panther or a Gray Panther. Like what would a group of like just children who bonded to fight for children's rights, what would that look like? And for example, when I'm working with people and I'm in the counseling role, I encourage them to take pride in a lot of their quote misbehaviors as kids. Like, you were trying to fight back. You were trying to stand up for yourself. You were trying to deliberately make things difficult for the adult world. You were trying to get some of your freedom back. Take some pride in your misbehavior. I encourage people to tell stories about fun, happy memories that they have of doing things that they weren't supposed to be doing. Maybe they got caught and maybe they didn't, but either way, to kind of revel in, one time we got away with doing this, and one time we went to this place where we weren't supposed to be going, and to really enjoy that, because that was one of the forms of resisting the oppression, was to just go ahead and do things that we shouldn't have been doing. Now, I'm not saying we always resisted the oppression in the best ways. We usually then ended up in certain behaviors that were really self-destructive, or that were not good for other kids, or that were just not good for the world. A lot of the tendency is to fight back from oppression by just becoming rude. And unfortunately, oddly, the same adult world that just mistreats children in so many ways will also then permit them all kinds of rudeness that they should not be allowed. The funny thing is, children are denied any meaningful voice, but are permitted to be rude. It's exactly backwards. It should be like, no, you don't get to be rude. You don't get to talk to me that way. But if you talk to me respectfully, I'm actually going to have your opinion really carry weight. I'm going to take you seriously. And of course, then we have to carry through on that. So I'm not saying we always fought back in the best ways, but I believe that we should take pride even in some of the ways we fought back that weren't terrific. Because just to notice, but I was trying to fight back, but I was trying not to give in, but I was trying somehow to get the world to notice how wrong the things were that were going on. And then last thing I'll say on this topic is that I believe that all oppressed groups have a culture. There's a culture of, women have a culture. It's a culture of resistance, and it's got all different kinds of things to it, and I know that women like certain aspects of the culture and don't like certain aspects of women's culture, but it's a culture, and it is formed somewhat in resistance to oppression, and it's its own world, right? And different oppressed groups, whether they're different people of color or the working class, everybody forms. The lesbians and gay men, there's cultures that form. Well, children have a culture. And it's a culture that we need to learn more about and respect and enter into and recognize how much of it is a healthy culture of resistance to oppression. Okay, so now I'm going to move to part 2, which is to talk about this lesson's counseling technique, which is actually going to be somewhat related to the theme about adultism. So I'm going to talk about a technique that for now I'm calling deep decisions or deep commitments from childhood. And I'll talk about how we use this in sessions today. So I believe that we all have moments in childhood where we make very, very deep decisions. And typically, I think we never tell anyone. Usually this happens just inside of ourselves, partly because these kinds of decisions tend to happen when we lack anyone who's really safe in our lives at that moment. So who was there to tell? But we made, at certain moments, certain very profound commitments that we were determined that we were going to live certain ways, that we were going to hold on very dearly to certain aspects of who we were, that we were going to hold on like hell to what we most deeply believed, including what we believed about what was right and what was wrong, held on dearly to what we believed about how we should be treated and how people around us should be treated, that we were going to hold on dearly to our love for certain people under circumstances where it was extremely difficult to keep loving that person, maybe because we were being told that we shouldn't love that person, or maybe because we were losing that person, or for different reasons. And so I made a list that you'll be able to refer to. I've included it below this video, and it's also in the co-counseling manual, that are just examples of commitments that you might have made. And I'm not saying you made necessarily any of these, although I bet you made at least one of these and maybe various of them. But I also think we will continue to add to this list as people remember more commitments that they made. And some examples of things from the list are things like, I'm never going to be like you. And that was, again, we probably never said that aloud. It was inside of ourselves, but we made that decision towards someone in our lives where we were very bitter about how that person was treating us or how that person was treating somebody else. I'm never going to be like you. Another example of a commitment that you might have made at any point was to someone that you had lost or that you were being pulled away from, I will always love you, or I will never forget you. With respect to wrongs that were happening around us, we may have made just a promise really to ourselves, I will never forget this. And it will never be okay with me what happened here. I'll give one more example. If we were moved away from a place that we loved, which is such a frequent aspect of modern childhood, or if a place that we loved was destroyed, which unfortunately is also a frequent aspect of modern childhood. A commitment, again, inside of ourselves, I will always treasure this place. I will always remember what this place was like. Now, you may not remember having ever made any of these kinds of commitments, but I deeply believe you made one or more of them at some point in your childhood. There are various reasons why we then forget having made them. We also often are not able really to carry out what we were committing to. Like some of us may have said, I am never going to become like my parents, or I'm never going to become like these other adults that are doing horrible things. And yet, over many years, their behavior did start to creep into our behavior. I'm not saying we were necessarily able to completely honor our commitments, but sometimes we had tremendous success in honoring those commitments. And in any event, we tried with every fiber of our being to honor those commitments and held on to them for as long as we could, and maybe held parts of them forever, even if we failed on holding certain other parts. But what matters the most to me isn't how we did, although that does matter, because there's pride in the extent to which we were able to keep those commitments. But how we're most using this as a counseling tool is to remember the moment of making that commitment and how intensely we felt about it, And by being able to connect with the depth of the decision that we made at the time, that often can lead us to a place where we can discharge really deeply about some of the wounds that were taking place around us. In other words, the circumstances that made it necessary for us to make those commitments. The connection with that commitment, I think why it tends to lead to discharge, why it tends to create such a powerful balance of attention, is because it leads us to remember how deep our beliefs were. It leads us to remember what good people we were. It leads us to be able to connect very viscerally with how wrong certain wrongs were that were being done. By sharing those with a counselor, we are then able to imagine what it would have been like if we'd been accompanied and loved at the time that we were making those commitments. There are all kinds of reasons why getting back in touch with those deep, deep childhood decisions has so much power to make it so that we can do some really major work on healing some of the painful experiences that we went through. If you can't remember any of these decisions, maybe you can remember different ones that you made. Play with it. Try to see if you can evoke any memories of deep commitments that you made. Another way that you can work with these is to just try different ones of them out, even if you don't remember any of them. Try saying them several times in a session. Try to say them with some feeling and emotion, the same way we do when we're using phrases or other types of counseling directions. And you may find by trying different ones out that one of them somehow speaks to you, and you start to think, I wonder if this is a decision I made at some point. You also can just always make something up that you guess maybe you might have committed to at some point. Just guess and try to play with that as a counseling direction. Use that in your session and just see if it starts to take you anywhere or not. Stick with it, for 5 or 10 minutes, the one that you made up. And it might take you somewhere and it might not, but this is a way to play with it. And what I find is that over time, you will either become clear that that was a decision you made, or playing with it will gradually start to unlock something inside you where you remember a different decision that really was the one that you made. Or you may start to remember various ones. I've worked with these kinds of concepts for years and have remembered actually now more than one, but multiple really, really deep commitments that I made as a kid that were so important to my emotional survival back then, and that are so important now as counters to my wounds, to help me be able to discharge them. So I encourage you in your next session, your next couple sessions, to start playing with this concept of deep decisions from childhood. You can use the list that's below this video, and as I say, let's keep adding to it as the years go by.